I've always been the odd one out in my family, the black sheep as they call it. Growing up, it was clear to me that I didn't quite fit into their perfect little mold. My older sister, Emily, was the golden child, beautiful, outgoing, and always center stage. I, on the other hand, was the quiet, anxious one who always seemed to ruin the vibe. My earliest memories are filled with moments where I felt like a burden. I remember family gatherings where I'd get overwhelmed by the noise and people. I'd retreat to my room, only to have my parents call me dramatic for not being able to handle normal situations. They'd never ask why I felt that way, just told me to toughen up. Emily, she was their shining star, always in the spotlight, always praised for everything she did. I was proud of her, sure, but it was hard to ignore the comparisons. "Why can't you be more like Emily?" they'd say. It felt like every time I showed a glimpse of who I was, it was shut down or labeled as wrong. By the time I reached my teens, my anxiety was no longer something I could hide. Simple things, like speaking up in class or meeting new people, felt like climbing Everest. My parents just brushed it off. "Michelle's being dramatic again," they'd tell others when I'd freeze up in public. I started believing them, thinking maybe I was just broken. Emily, though, had no problem adding to it. "You're so weird," she'd say, when I'd fumble through conversations. Or worse, she'd laugh at me in front of others. To her, I was a joke, but it wasn't funny to me. It hurt. When I got to college, something changed. I found myself sitting in the counselor's office, crying as I tried to explain why I always felt like a mess. That's when I heard it for the first time. "You have social anxiety disorder, Michelle." Those words hit me hard. I wasn't broken. I wasn't dramatic. There was a name for what I'd been dealing with my whole life. I started therapy, slowly piecing myself back together. For the first time, I began to understand that it wasn't my fault. And more importantly, I didn't have to live my life trying to please people who refused to understand me. That's when I began setting boundaries with my family. It wasn't easy, and they didn't take it well. My parents acted like I was being selfish, and Emily, she barely noticed. But for the first time, I was doing something for myself, and that mattered. Looking back, those were the first steps towards the person I am today. But at the time, I had no idea how much further I'd have to go, or how complicated things would get with Emily. When Emily announced her engagement to Jonathan, I wasn't surprised. She had always loved grand gestures, and being the center of attention, a wedding was the perfect stage for her. She called me the day after he proposed, not to share the happy news, but to make sure I understood my place. "Michelle," she said, in her sugary sweet voice, the kind she used when she was being fake. "I don't want any drama during the wedding. You know how you can get." I rolled my eyes, holding the phone away from my ear for a moment. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come on, Michelle. You know how you make things about yourself," she said, as if I'd ever tried to steal the spotlight in my life. "I just need you to be low-key for me." I didn't argue. It wasn't worth it. I congratulated her and told her I'd do my best. Months went by, and while Emily's wedding plans were in full swing, I noticed something odd. I wasn't included in anything. No dress shopping, no bridal showers, no discussions about bridesmaids. At first, I thought she was just being Emily, controlling and wanting to do everything herself. But then, during a family dinner, it all came out. We were sitting around the table when my mom casually mentioned the bridesmaids' dresses. I blinked. "Bridesmaids?" I asked. "I didn't know you picked bridesmaids already." The room went quiet. Emily looked at me, then at her plate. My dad cleared his throat. "Well," Emily started, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. I didn't think you'd want to be involved. Why wouldn't I want to be involved? I asked, my voice rising just a bit. Honestly, Michelle, she sighed dramatically. Jonathan thinks you're distracting. I mean, you're single, and you've always had this way about you. I just didn't want to risk any unnecessary tension. I stared at her, completely floored. Are you serious? I asked, barely able to process her words. Don't make this a big deal, she snapped. I'm just trying to keep things simple. That night, I went home feeling humiliated and furious. She wasn't just excluding me. She was accusing me of something so ridiculous, it made my head spin. It wasn't the first time Emily had made me feel small, but this was on another level. I decided not to fight her on it. I kept my distance, avoiding wedding events and focusing on my own life. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need to be part of her big day. But then, everything changed the night before the wedding. The night before Emily's wedding, I was determined to stay out of the chaos. My plan was simple: a quiet evening at home, curled up with a book and a cup of chamomile tea. I'd made peace, or so I thought, with my exclusion from the wedding events. To be honest, the thought of sitting through the rehearsal dinner, watching my family pretend everything was picture perfect, didn't appeal to me anyway. Emily had made it clear I wasn't welcome, and I had no intention of forcing my way into a situation where I was unwelcome. But around 9 p.m., my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be another passive-aggressive text from my mom or Emily. Instead, it was Jonathan. Jonathan. Why would he be calling me? We'd barely exchanged more than a handful of words. Over the years he'd been with Emily. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of trap? Or was he calling to berate me on Emily's behalf? Against my better judgment, I answered, "Hello, Michelle." His voice was tight, almost hesitant. "Yes," I said cautiously. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I need to ask you something," he said, his tone serious. I frowned. "Sure, what's going on?" There was a pause on the other end, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke. "Emily's been telling me some things about you." He began carefully. "Things that don't make sense. She's been saying that you've been causing problems, trying to interfere with the wedding, even trying to get my attention." I felt the air leave my lungs. "What?" I managed to say. "I didn't believe it at first," he continued. "But she's been so insistent. Tonight, I started thinking about it, and something just didn't sit right with me. So, I started asking questions. My chest tightened with anger and disbelief. "Jonathan, none of that is true," I said firmly. "I've stayed out of this wedding as much as possible, because Emily made it clear she didn't want me involved. I've barely even spoken to you." "I know," he said. "That's what started making me question everything. I talked to a few people, saw some of the messages Emily sent about you. And Michelle, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how badly she's been treating you." For a moment, I was speechless. Someone outside the family had finally seen Emily for who she really was. "Thank you," I said quietly. "There's more," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I don't think I can go through with the wedding. Not after this." I sat up straighter, gripping the phone tightly. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to tell her tonight," he said. "I can't marry someone who treats people this way, especially her own sister." A mix of emotions washed over me: shock, relief, and a strange sense of validation. Jonathan wasn't just walking away from Emily. He was standing up for me in a way my own family never had. "I'm sorry this happened," I said finally, "but I think you're making the right decision." "Thanks, Michelle," he said softly, "for being honest. And I'm sorry for everything you've had to deal with because of her." When the call ended, I sat there in stunned silence. For the first time, someone had called out Emily's behavior and chosen to walk away. The next morning, the fallout began. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly. Texts, missed calls, and voicemails flooded in, all from family members. I didn't need to listen to the messages to know what had happened. Jonathan had called off the wedding. Despite everything, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. For once, the truth had come to light, even if it meant all hell was about to break loose. I got out of bed, bracing myself for what was to come, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I woke up to a storm, both literal and figurative. Rain battered against my bedroom window, and my phone was buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. I knew what it was before I even picked it up. I stared at the screen, blinking at the flood of notifications. 20 missed calls from Mom, 10 voicemails from Dad, over 50 messages from Emily. I didn't even bother opening them. Part of me wanted to throw my phone out the window and pretend none of this was happening, but I couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Jonathan had actually gone through with it. He had called off the wedding. Before I could even decide what to do, there was a pounding on my apartment door. My stomach dropped. I had a terrible feeling I knew who it was. When I peeked through the peephole, my worst fears were confirmed. Mom, Dad, and Emily were all standing there, soaked from the rain but looking furious. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and opened the door a crack. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "What are we doing here?" Mom snapped, pushing the door open wider. "What have you done, Michelle?" I stepped back, trying to put some space between us. "I haven't done anything. Don't you dare lie to us," Emily shrieked, her voice hoarse. "Jonathan called off the wedding because of you." I stared at her, stunned by the sheer audacity. "Because of me? Emily, you're the one who treated me like garbage and lied to him about me. Did you really think he wouldn't figure it out?" Emily's face turned red, her jaw tightening. "You've always been jealous of me," she hissed. "You couldn't stand to see me happy, so you ruined everything." My dad stepped forward, his face set in a grim frown. "Michelle, you owe your sister an explanation. This is her wedding day, for God's sake." I let out a bitter laugh. "An explanation? You mean like the one she owes me for years of bullying and exclusion, or for accusing me of things I never did? If Jonathan decided not to marry her, that's on her, not me." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but not the kind of tears that came from understanding or compassion. These were tears of anger and frustration. "You could have fixed this, Michelle. You could have told him whatever he needed to hear to make things right." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want me to lie? To cover for her behavior?" "It's family, Michelle," Mom shouted. "Family sticks together, no matter what." I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. Family doesn't treat each other the way she's treated me. Family doesn't demand lies and cover-ups. And I'm done pretending like that's normal. Emily lunged toward me, but Dad grabbed her arm, holding her back. She was shaking with rage, tears streaming down her face. "You'll regret this," she spat. "You've destroyed my life, and I'll make sure you pay for it." Her words hung in the air like a threat. Mom and Dad exchanged uneasy glances before pulling her away. "We'll talk about this later," Mom said coldly as they left. I locked the door behind them, my hands trembling. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. The rest of the day was a blur. I turned off my phone, unable to deal with the barrage of messages. I felt raw, like an exposed nerve, but I also felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For years, I'd been holding everything in, biting my tongue, walking on eggshells, and trying to keep the peace. But now, the dam had finally broken. It wasn't pretty, and it definitely wasn't painless. But for the first time, I felt like I'd stood up for myself. That night, I sat in my quiet apartment, listening to the rain outside. The storm inside me had started to settle. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. Chapter 5. The aftermath. The next morning, I woke to an eerie silence. No buzzing phone, no pounding on the door, just the soft hum of my apartment. The storm outside had cleared, but inside, I felt like I was standing in the eye of a hurricane. Cautiously, I turned my phone back on. The flood of messages continued. Emily's texts had gone from fury to desperation. You ruined everything. You'll pay for this. Mom and Dad hate you now. You're disgusting. Fix this, Michelle. You owe me. Please. Just talk to Jonathan and tell him it's all a misunderstanding. It was like scrolling through the stages of grief, all of them laced with venom. There were messages from Mom and Dad too. Dad's were short and biting. You've shamed this family. Call me. Now. Mom's were more emotionally manipulative. Your sister is heartbroken. How could you do this to her? You're tearing this family apart. We're still your parents. Don't forget that. I stared at the screen, feeling a familiar heaviness in my chest. Years of guilt and obligation clawed at me, begging me to respond, to smooth things over, to make everything right. But then I thought about the day before, about Emily screaming at me, Mom demanding I lie, and Dad's cold indifference. I thought about Jonathan calling to apologize for something that wasn't even his fault, and I made a decision. I spent the morning gathering everything, every text, voicemail, and photo I had as evidence of Emily's harassment. I wasn't going to let her threats hang over me like a dark cloud. If she wanted to escalate this, I'd be ready. By noon, I was sitting in a small office at the police station. The officer behind the desk listened carefully as I explained the situation, her expression growing more serious with every detail. You did the right thing coming here, she said when I finished. It sounds like this has been building for a while. Do you feel safe at home? I hesitated. I think so. But I don't know what Emily is capable of anymore. She's already vandalized my car once. I'm worried about what she might do next. The officer nodded and started filing the report. She explained the process for requesting a restraining order and advised me to document everything moving forward. As I left the station, I felt a mix of fear and empowerment. Taking this step was terrifying, but it was also a way of reclaiming control. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was protecting myself. That afternoon, the chaos followed me to my workplace. I was in the middle of a meeting when the receptionist knocked on the conference room door, looking flustered. Michelle, your sister is here, she whispered. My stomach dropped. I excused myself and hurried to the lobby, where Emily was pacing back and forth, her makeup smeared and her hair disheveled. What are you doing here? I asked, keeping my voice low. She spun around, her eyes blazing. You're not answering my calls. What else was I supposed to do? This is my workplace, Emily, I said firmly. You can't just show up here. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a hiss. Do you have any idea what you've done to me, to my life? Jonathan is gone. Mom and Dad are furious. And it's all because of you. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Jonathan left because of how you treated me. That's not my fault, Emily. That's on you. Her face twisted with rage. You think you're so perfect, don't you? Playing the victim all the time, making everyone feel sorry for you. Well, guess what? Nobody cares. You're just pathetic. I felt a pang of hurt. but it was quickly replaced by resolve. "I'm not doing this with you, Emily. You need to leave. Now." She didn't move. Instead, she smirked. "You think you're untouchable, don't you? Just wait." I turned and walked away, my heart pounding. By the time I got back to my desk, I knew what I had to do. I called the police station and added the incident to my report. That evening, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by silence once again. I was emotionally drained, but proud of myself for standing my ground. The texts and calls from my family continued to trickle in, but I didn't respond. I blocked Emily's number and changed the locks on my door, just in case. As I sat on the couch, I realized something. I wasn't scared anymore. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control of my life. It wasn't just about standing up to Emily. It was about breaking free from the toxic patterns that had ruled my life for so long. This wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a step toward reclaiming my peace, and for that, I was grateful. The days following Emily's outburst at my workplace were both tense and strangely quiet. I'd made my decisions, and now I had to live with them. Blocking Emily's number and filing the police report were bold moves, but they didn't erase the years of emotional manipulation. That weight still lingered, and I knew it would take time to lift. The rest of my family wasn't far behind in trying to break me down. Mom left voicemails filled with guilt-laden pleas, while Dad's rare attempts at communication came in sharp, dismissive texts. "You'll regret this, Michelle. You've turned your back on your family. Fix this mess before it's too late." Every time I read or listened to their messages, the pit in my stomach grew. But with each passing day, it became clearer. I didn't need them in my life. I couldn't keep sacrificing my mental health just to keep a fractured, toxic family dynamic afloat. One morning, about a week after Emily's meltdown, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone. It was time. I opened the family group chat, AI, space that had always been more of a battleground than a sanctuary, and typed a message I never thought I'd send. "To everyone in this chat, I've made my decision. I'm stepping away from this family dynamic. For years, I've been dismissed, manipulated, and disrespected, and I can't do it anymore. This isn't an act of anger. It's a choice for my own peace and well-being. Please don't contact me further. I wish you all the best." My hands trembled as I hit send. Within seconds, the group chat lit up with reactions. Emily's response was predictable. "Wow, playing the victim again. You're pathetic." Mom wasn't far behind. "Michelle, this is cruel. How can you do this to us after everything we've done for you?" Dad, true to form, didn't say much. "Do what you want. You're no daughter of mine." I read the messages, my heart aching but resolute. I left the chat, blocked their numbers, and set my phone down. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of liberation. With the immediate drama behind me, I focused on the parts of my life that mattered. Therapy sessions became a cornerstone of my healing. My therapist, Dr. Lang, helped me unpack years of emotional wounds and offered tools to build stronger boundaries. Cutting ties doesn't mean you've failed, she reminded me during one session. It means you've chosen to protect yourself. That's not weakness, it's strength. Outside of therapy, I began to reconnect with the small circle of friends I'd built over the years. People who truly cared about me, who listened without judgment, and who never made me feel like a burden. One evening, I confided in my friend Rachel over coffee. "It feels so strange," I admitted, stirring my latte, "like I'm mourning something, even though I know it's what I needed to do." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "That's normal. You're grieving the family you wanted, not the one you had, but you're also making space for the life you deserve." Her words stuck with me. I wasn't just walking away from my family. I was walking towards something better. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Jonathan. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. Inside was a handwritten note, short and to the point. Michelle, I wanted to say thank you for being honest, for standing your ground, and for helping me see the truth about Emily. I'm sorry for everything you've endured, and I hope you know you deserve so much better. Take care of yourself. Jonathan. I sat back, the letter resting in my lap. For so long, I'd been conditioned to believe that standing up for myself would lead to isolation and rejection. But here was proof that doing the right thing, even when it was hard, could lead to unexpected support. Months passed, and the noise of my family's chaos began to fade. I moved to a new apartment across town, changed my phone number, and created a life that felt truly mine. Every day wasn't perfect, and the scars from my family's treatment didn't disappear overnight. But I found moments of joy, mourning, walks in the park, dinners with friends, and quiet evenings spent reading without the weight of guilt pressing down on me. One day, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset, I realized something profound. For the first time in my life, I felt at peace. Life without the looming presence of my family was both liberating and unsettling. For so long, their disapproval, manipulation, and chaos had been constants in my life. Now, with that weight gone, I was left with an unfamiliar quiet. It was a strange kind of freedom, one that I had to learn to embrace. In the first few weeks, I found myself reaching for my phone out of habit, expecting another tirade of messages. When none came, I felt relief, but also a pang of something else. Guilt, maybe, or grief. It was like losing something I never truly had. During one therapy session, I admitted this to Dr. Lang. I know I made the right decision, I said, twisting a tissue in my hands. But it still hurts. Cutting ties hasn't magically fixed everything. She nodded, her gaze steady and kind. That's because you're mourning the idea of what a family should be. It's a process, Michelle. Grief and healing aren't linear. Her words stayed with me. I wasn't just walking away from my family. I was untangling myself from years of unmet expectations, disappointments, and pain. To keep myself grounded, I threw myself into my work. My job, which had always been a source of stability, became even more important. I started volunteering at a local animal shelter on weekends, finding comfort in the unconditional affection of the dogs and cats. I also began exploring hobbies I'd once loved, but had abandoned during the chaos of my family's demands. Painting, for one, became a way to express emotions I couldn't put into words. One evening, as I added the finishing touches to a watercolor sunset, I realized I was smiling, not out of politeness, not to mask anxiety, but because I genuinely felt good. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. One of the most surprising parts of my journey was the support I found online. I joined a forum for people who had gone through similar experiences with toxic families, and it became a lifeline. Sharing my story was terrifying at first, but the responses were overwhelmingly kind. "You're so brave for choosing yourself," one person wrote. "Walking away is the hardest but most freeing thing you'll ever do," said another. Their words gave me strength. I wasn't alone in this, and for the first time, I felt understood in a way my family had never made me feel. Months after I'd cut ties, I received an unexpected email from Emily. The subject line read, "Can we talk?" Against my better judgment, I opened it. "Michelle, I know we're not on good terms, but I've been thinking about everything that's happened. I don't want things to stay this way forever. Maybe we can meet up and talk. Let me know." Emily. My heart raced as I read the message. Part of me wanted to believe she'd changed, that she was ready to apologize and make amends. But another part of me, the part that had endured years of her cruelty, knew better. I forwarded the email to Dr. Lang and talked it through with her during our next session. "Do you think she's sincere?" I asked. Dr. Lang tilted her head thoughtfully. "It's possible, but it's also possible she's looking to regain control. The important question is, what do you want, Michelle? Do you feel ready to re-engage, or would that jeopardize your progress?" I thought about it for a long time before responding to Emily. My reply was brief but firm. "Emily, I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm not ready to have this conversation. I need to focus on my own healing right now." Michelle, her response never came, and I was okay with that. As the months turned into a year, I felt myself transforming. I wasn't the same Michelle who had once bent over backward to appease her family. I was learning to prioritize myself, to value my own peace over their approval. One afternoon, I visited a local park I hadn't been to in years. It was a sunny day, and the sound of children laughing and birds chirping filled the air. As I sat on a bench, sipping my coffee and watching the world go by, I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. This was my life now. Quiet, simple, and mine. I wasn't naive enough to believe I'd healed completely. There were still moments of doubt, of sadness, of longing for the family I wished I'd had, but those moments were fewer and farther between. For the first time, I felt like I was truly living, not for anyone else, but for me. In the end, cutting ties with my family wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something new, something better. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't need to. What mattered was that I was moving forward, one step at a time, toward a life filled with love, peace, and purpose, and that was enough.